Hopefully today will be a technology-friendly one, right? Again, my name is Chioma Oruh, and I'm from Washington, D.C. Um, I, I want to first introduce Washington, D.C. as the place where people are actually from, not a place where people are deciding or the Comey hearings are happening or, Trump is causing the most ultimate damage on our country, right? This is a place where real people live with real lives and real contradictions and real issues that are impacted by the necessity for basic income. I want to, again, start with the concept of criticism and self-criticism. So the goal for me for coming to this conference from DC today was to come with a group, right? And I found that there were a lot of pushbacks in terms of, DC, for the real DC, is a very progressive town. I will say that, right? Like there's a lot of people with great politics in the city. But there is a lot of resistance to latching on to a new issue such as basic income, and it is new to the intelligence of our community of organizers. I primarily organize through a coalition called the Inclusive Prosperity Coalition, which is a coalition of parent advocates with children with disabilities in the District of Columbia. I am a parent of children with disabilities, two children ages 4 to 6 on the autism spectrum. And so the other part about this, to be self-critical, not just put the blame on the other, is that, the energy that it requires to engage in the educational conversations and the grassroots organizing in a guerrilla kind of style, which is what's going to be needed. There's a lot of shortage of time and energy and resources to do that grunt work, especially when you're kind of proposing it sort of in isolation and it feels like a tag on to other issues. So I look forward to this network as an opportunity to deepen and talk about strategies as a co-learning. This is how I'm looking at it, and learning the successes in other areas and figuring out ways how to best communicate with my community, right? One thing that's very, very prevalent in the District of Columbia is institutional racism. I'm gonna dig deeper into what that means to my hometown, but part of the resistance, at least from the Black left, is that we have to deal with issues of internal colonialism, the historic and systemic discriminations against Black communities, Black and brown communities, and what's basic income going to do to help us resolve that issue and tell me in a way that I can understand and resolve my personal contradictions, right? Unconscious biases. So within our coalition, we do have partners with the Children's Law Center and Advocates for Justice in Education and the DC Fiscal Policy Institute, specifically them, who take on different economic projects, and they have a position on basic income. I wouldn't be introducing basic income to that think tank, but their position is in opposition to basic income. And as I filter through why that is, I feel, and this is my analysis on it, is my personal analysis on it, is that it is rooted within some attachment to what it means to work to earn your keep and contribute. And a lot of our left-leaning, socialist-oriented organizers tend to be attached to the concept of labor as a value that cannot be separated from general quality of life. So there is the introduction of the concept of basic income to our most disparaged populations, and then there is the getting the buy-in from those who are versed in political economy to expand their understanding of what this could mean. So there's a lot going on in DC, as I'm sure there is a lot going on in your communities, and hopefully we'll come to some resolution. So this is how I understand basic income. I've had to kind of self-teach myself this, which is another reason why I'm excited to be here, because I really am here, excited to learn, excited to get tools to be more empowered to take it back to my community and incorporate it in my language and in my organizing, especially because I work with directly impacted families that are, majority single mothers struggling for the educational rights for their children with myriad disabilities, and in my case, autism, right? So my understanding is, based on what's out there online, which is periodic cash payments of unconditional delivered to all individuals on an individual basis without a means test. Now, this is the part that I particularly like, and I'll explain why. Oh, and that it's the government's responsibility to do so. So I know that there is, some, studies happening out in Oakland and that Silicon Valley is latching on to this. And, I'm very critical of neoliberalism, and I really don't want to see basic income to be something that is adopted and attached to the neoliberal economy. I am very much against that. Because, as a civil servant and as one who really believes in the role of government as the most objective and party that will have the most integrity in facilitating this, that is the aspect I want to drive on this. I want to talk about intersectionality, right? And our previous presenter had kind of talked about that too, and thank you for that. In that, some of the resistance, as I mentioned, around institutional racism is that there are overlapping things happening that would benefit from basic income, and that creates suspicion about basic income. So whether it's racism classically, or sexism, heterosexism, ableism, colonialism, classism, we're dealing with very traumatized issues or populations that are dealing with these issues. So introducing an economic model that is new and that, really part of the unconscious bias too, is that what will you then say to populations when you can't talk about unemployment as the reason for their poverty? Or you can't talk about, why people are poor based on a whole bunch of things that have to do with your worth in the workforce. And that is the basis of all these isms. I just want to define intersectionality. Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a legal scholar, she defines it as a framework that describes how overlapping forms of discriminations and how structures make certain co-occurring identities, single mothers, African Americans, LGBTQ, immigrants or homeless families, raising children with disabilities, are vulnerable to the exclusion and other forms of oppression. Intersectionality offers intellectual space to interrogate how certain privileges impact social outcomes and the role of institutional decision-making practices and policies and laws. So one thing I want us to, kind of self-identify in this space is that why are there not many people of color who would probably be the primary benefactors of such a thing as basic income in this room right now, right? What are the contributing factors to that? Let's interrogate that together, right? And I think intersectionality offers a good framework to look at that. Another thing that in getting grounded in why I like basic income, or I am supportive of implementing some variation of this, is again, this concept of a mean test. So for me, as my own case study, living in the District of Columbia, which I'm gonna hone down in on in a second, is that, the means test is flawed. And I know this can be a conservative argument here, but I think that it does have value in saying that it is outdated how we measure wealth in the United States, right? Which historically compares to families' pre-tax income to an income poverty threshold. So if my value, if I'm making, X amount of dollars, and it looks like I'm making $80,000, but in reality I'm making something like $50,000 when you take out all my taxes, and you take out my insurance, and you take out all the things that you do before you even start paying rent and food. If that becomes the lens in which you calculate my wealth, then you will never come to understand the struggles that when I can't make basic income, right? So it's flawed on that perspective. And another way is that families fall below the threshold. If families fall below the threshold, it's considered poor. It sets the poverty line at 3 times the cost of basic bag of groceries which accounts for the third of living, which today, it's really about a seventh of the cost of living, while housing has taken, really, at least in Washington, D.C., where gentrification is a huge deal, the income gap is extremely wide. I mean, your rent alone will kill your, and we're in New York, so I'm sure I'm talking to the choir here around that question, but it is extremely vulgar in D.C. at this point, as far as my subjective perspective. Failures to consider the growing burden on non-discretionary expenses like housing, childcare. Childcare is a huge deal, has been a big deal in the District of Columbia for a long time. It's just ridiculous how expensive childcare is. And know that you have a child with a disability and you may not necessarily qualify for Medicaid because of the means test. What happens to you then in getting the optimal support? There are some caveats, but what you have to do to qualify for some of these programs is you have to sell your grandmother to be able to get into some of these programs, right? And the wait lists are extremely high. So it also doesn't account for the variation in the costs of living based on geographic location. As I mentioned, what $100,000 means in Milwaukee, Wisconsin is very different from what $100,000 means in Washington, D.C., right? Or anywhere USA, right? Small town USA, big town USA. So I want to talk about the city that I love, that I serve, that has abused me in many ways. DC has a bigger income disparity than any state in the country. Did you know that? That the top 10% of earners make more than 6 times the amount as the bottom 10%. And that the more variability in low-paying jobs, the discrepancy between the top and the bottom earners is more stark than in other areas, right? It's from a Post article 2015. So DC's, the legal people who work within the legal field, the average person in the legal field earns 5 times the amount of the average sales employee, which in California and New York is 4 times as high, and North Carolina and Texas is 3 times as high. This is from the same article. Virtual disappearance of the low-cost housing means that most extreme low-income residents in DC are forced to spend the majority of their income on rent. And it is not just the most extremely low income. It is particularly oppressive to those of us living in the most abject poverty. But for somebody in my category, I am still paying over 80% of my rent. I got student loans debt. I got child care issues. I have therapies that I have to have a copay on. And to do all of that and have food, and to do that and have 80% over of my income going just to rent is ridiculously painful, and I can't stress that. Housing can take 80% or more of the monthly income of residents, right? Stressing that again. Families that devote too much of their income to rent are forced to cut back on food and other such considerations, and may be unable to afford transportation, work, the doctor, or a host of other things. 1 in every 5 children in the District of Columbia live in families that spend more than 80%. So that's that, right? Fiscal Policy Institute, one of our partners in our coalition, they put out a lot of information that's helpful and useful, and I hope to win them to a progressive stance on basic income because they're so spectacular. But they offer this, this percentage of low-income renters and their share of their housing. So as you can see, that those who pay 80 to 100% on rent are the poorest populations. Or the majority of the people who make low income at 42%. And part of the root to this is in an Atlantic article that I came across, in that backed into intersectionality, is that this is rooted in institutionalized and historic systemic racism, which is that DC historically, the white families in DC are on average 81 times richer than the black ones. and I just want to say this before I get into some of these numbers, is that DC per capita has one of the wealthiest group of black people anywhere in the world. I mean, I didn't need the Cosby Show to show me what a black doctor and a black lawyer in a household looks like. That's pervasive in Washington, D.C. And that's a big deal in the black community, because all the stuff that's happening with Bill Cosby now, part of the pain of that in the black community is that that was the pride of what it meant to be black and successful. And you looked to that. But in Washington, D.C., we didn't need that to have our value. We have Howard University, which I'm a proud graduate of. We have a plethora of other universities in the city that have, and Howard produces more black PhDs, more black doctors of a variety than any other university in the world. And, well, maybe not exception of Africa, but in the United States at the very least, right? And that we're proud of that. You know, it's a pride in that. But what that translates to economically is dismal, especially compared with the changing face of the District of Columbia. White families on average make around have about $142,000 in savings, assets, minus debt. Black families have only about $11,000, and I think that is a very generous summation, right? For single black mothers, our average wealth is maybe like $5 or something like that. And there was a recent study put out by the National Domestic Workers Alliance that talks about the status of black women's work in America. And it's not great, right? So the wealth gap is worse now than it was in the 80s. And in the 80s in DC, if you don't know, was a very, very traumatic moment. There was a lot of crime, a lot of drugs. The cocaine and drug trade was extremely high, leaping into the 90s when DC was tagged one of the most violent places to live. And there'd been a lot of work done, you know, in terms of public safety to put controls on that, to restore some of the dignity of people living in safe communities. But you know, we're living economically in the same kind of trauma that led to that. So check that out, right? So even with the prevalence of public sector jobs, a large black population and a high share of black businesses, owners, and wealth gap is staggering. As again, there's a very proud and successful population of black people in Washington, D.C. If we are doing this bad, it makes me scared for the rest of America, right? D.C. is not an outlier. LA's median wealth for whites is 89 times as much as blacks. Miami's is 30 times high. Tulsa, Oklahoma is 18 times high. And Tulsa is particularly interesting in that that was the home of Black Wall Street that was obliterated, that was literally targeted to be destroyed because it threatened a certain segment of the white population that did not want to see black wealth happen. So if you don't know that history, it's one to look into, and how the prevalence of inequality continues to persist. So inequality stems from home ownership playing a significant role. Again, I just talked about renting being so high. Whites living in DC are much likelier than blacks to own homes. Whites with less than a high school education are more likely to own homes than blacks with any level of education. And I just said we have one of the highest population of educated black lawyers, doctors, of variety than anywhere else in the country, and likely anywhere else in the world. White homeowners have a value of 70% greater than average value of black homes, worth approximately $250,000. Homes go up to about $1 million and plus, counting in DC at this time, which is a big deal because this is a new phenomenon, right, at least in the past decade. Blacks in the district have faced more than 2 centuries of deliberately constructed barriers to wealth building, and some of the highest barriers were embedded are in law. Right, currently on the books locally and federally. If we look at HUD policies, and when we look at the killing of the welfare bill to introduce TANF, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, and its impact on black wealth, or the ability to, some of the rules were really limiting to really constructing a 2-income family, and it encouraged a single income family. I'll get into that, and it's probably better to talk about that informally. Communities of colors with long established roots in DC facing increasing economic values and pressures at times when many other residents benefit from rising income. This is what I see as the roots of gentrification, right? So there is a specific target to people who are longtime DC residents in terms of the impact of poverty. Almost half of the poorest, fifth of households in DC are headed by someone that was born in the District of Columbia, compared to 70% of poverty that is outside, people that are born outside of DC. Wages have fallen since 2007 for working residents without a college degree, and some 28% of DC residents with high school diplomas are underemployed in 2014, working part-time despite wanting full-time hours, and a discouraged look for work compared to 17% in 2007. So the TANF crisis, actually the TANF crisis is what inspired me to look into alternative economic means. I cannot understand, or I could not, what led me to really get excited about basic income were two things, like looking at my local contradiction, and it was promoted by an activist I really respect, Kalia Kuno, who was the campaign manager for the successful campaign in Jackson, Mississippi, which was a great campaign and a great achievement, and they are committed to basic income. I just want to figure out a way to make that intelligence resonate internally in DC. But there was a working group of which DC Fiscal Policy Institute was a part of, and because we're part of another coalition, let me know about the TANF crisis that's happening in DC, the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, which was introduced under the Clinton administration to replace the welfare bill. TANF offers low-income families cash, job training, child care. It even helps pay rent and other bills for over 15,000 residents. But there was a threat of over 6,000 families. This started about a year ago to become an issue where over 6,000 families were going to lose eligibility because they time out after about 5 years of being TANF recipients based on district law. Typical average payout is about $400 a month, which I would think universal basic income would augment and be more humane. I mean, who lives off of $400,000 a month in a town where average rent is about $2,000 a month alone, right? And that's being conservative there. The district council voted to eliminate the cutoffs, so there's been success in terms of that, after advocates criticized this policy of the 5-year cutoff as arbitrary. Council divided TANF benefits into child and parent portions. I don't really know what this, this is against some of these unconscious biases. There's a report that I'd be happy to share with anyone, and it's online on a Washington Post article that talks about part of the whole mentality of the 5-year cutoff is that if by 5 years you haven't gotten your act together, well, then there's something wrong with you, right? Not systemic racism, not the historic disparity of income, of wealth, and what this means in the United States, and not that even if you are a productive working citizen, the only thing that maybe opportunes me from not being on TANF is the means test and access to some credit. I mean, if you don't have access to credit, the neoliberal market is offsetting what the government technically should be doing for somebody like me, because mathematically, my numbers are crazy as any other citizen in the district. Without credit, I would be on the streets, right? Me and my kids, right? Council, so they divided it 80 to 20%. The goal, incentive for parents to comply with working requirements in the program while aiming to not harm children. Again, this concept that, if you can't get your act together, we'll want to fund the children. We don't want to fund these dysfunctional parents. And mind you, these dysfunctional parents, 96% of the head of households for these TANF recipient families are single mothers, the median age of 33 years old. And so there's a gendered aspect to this perspective of who is supposed to be productive and why and how. My dissertation is on matriarchy, on primordial African matriarchy, and how it shows up in the Black community in the Democratic Republic of Congo, as far as the rape crisis is concerned, but it is very applicable to the impact on Black communities here in the United States. In that, if we're looking at the history of the matrifocal reality of what it has meant in pre-colonial Africa, that the mother transfers wealth, that is the basis of how wealth is passed down, then the criminality of having 96% of the poorest people being single Black women unable to transfer wealth, right, or probably transfer debt more than wealth to their children, is personally offensive. And the explanations of it, without including the impact of colonialism, lack of access to land, the impact of slavery, lack of access to identity and being able to be self-determined, the continuity of neocolonialism, internal colonialism. There's just so many things in these isms that when you just look at the explanation being that she may be disabled, or she may be a drug addict, or she may, all the things of the welfare queen that we know was defined for us in the 80s, that's the image that comes up. Not this history of people with dignity, people able, and that were positioned, given the aspect to transfer wealth, to now be some of these poorest populations. I can go off in tangents. I hope somebody's timing me. I will, I'm almost done. Okay? Basic income and systemic oppression. Reemergence of racism in American society is extremely a reason why in this era, in the Trump era, where we're looking at just doubling down of some of these very, very insulting and archaic ways of looking at people of color in general. As an immigrant, a first generation American, there's that layer of it too. And the impact that has on policy, some of the ways he's trying to pass on, and some of these other systemic things that I've mentioned, regardless of who has been president, leads me to feel that basic income is a progressive step it's a step in a progressive direction to fix some of these problems, creating equity. If we can't have reparations, can we have basic income, right? Which would be of reparations for all. We were all sufferers. I mean, I even talked in some aspects of populations of white people being, the trauma of slavery and colonialism belongs to you too, right? When I look at how white people are jumping onto Trump, there's pain that's informing that. The poverty that's there on the ground for middle class and working class white America is not different in reality from the pain and historic and systemic, and we're all part of this story together. The movement for Black Lives has adopted basic income, which is great, but again, even our local DC Black Lives Matter chapter doesn't talk about it much, but we're gonna get that intelligence there, and I look forward to strategies. Of course, I'm really encouraged and inspired by what's happening in Canada around basic income. And so it's where do we go from here? I'll just leave on these thoughts. These are my last thoughts on this. In that, in Washington, D.C., we have lots of opportunity right now, at least from my perspective. We have many parents who are waking up and coming into political life with at least in perspective of making sure that their children's educational rights are protected. There is an intersection with that. How are your children's economic rights being protected if you aren't protected? If you cannot show up well and right for your children? If you are there's one woman in our coalition who went from living in her home with her partner, and it was a domestic violence situation. She ends up in a shelter, and the move from home to shelter for the parent of a child with a disability is ridiculous, because this child needed in-home therapy, behavioral therapy, and so there was no home for the parent to for the therapist to go to, and they were not going to go to the shelter. Shelters are some of the most unsafe spaces. So basic income, being able to touch people where they're at, being able to relate to people where they're at is a perspective that I see as our strength, and that we do have people in coalition. We just need to be able to find the winning argument to make this part of our agenda. Thank you.